Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis, LA and dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello.
Hello, could I please speak with Alex Ross?
This is he.
Alex, it's such a pleasure to have you on the phone. This is Paul Holdengräber calling you from the Quarantine Tapes. I'm really delighted that you are part of this. I felt that your voice was very important to this series. So thank you so much for taking my call. Where does my call actually find you at this moment?
Oh, well, thank you so much for asking me to be a part of this, Paul. I am in Los Angeles. I divide my time between Los Angeles and New York these days, and the crisis found me on the West Coast. So I've been here since the middle of March, and trying to keep myself reasonably sane, like everyone else.
Yeah, reasonably sane is a word for the moment. I keep marveling at the fact that when I ask people at times now how they are, they actually quite often pause before answering that question. It's as if this moment has really heightened the stakes in such a huge way. And we don't quite know. We need to check in with ourselves as to how we are and what even that question might mean in these times.
Yeah, the usual banalities don't quite suffice. No,
they don't. I'm fine. How are you? Is not the answer I get all the time, which is the answer one used to get all the time. So one might even imagine that patterns of speech and thought may when one is optimistic, change with this pandemic, perhaps. Who knows?
Yeah.
But I am curious about one thing. What was the last concert you attended before the lockdown?
Well, I remember very well. It was a remarkable event at Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. It was a recital by the young American pianist Conrad Tao on March 10th, and he performed a program with a strong political slant to it. It was music of the contemporary American composer Frederick Rzewski, together with Aaron Copland, who, of course, had strong left-wing political commitments in the 1930s and 40s. And the big piece of the program, the final piece of the program, was Rzewski's gigantic sequence of variations on the Chilean revolutionary song, "The People United Will Never Be Defeated." So that was the last music I heard live.
and it's amazing. It's amazing how precise one can be. I mean, I'm sure in your line of business, you remember the date of many of the concerts, but you remember May 10th. I mean, it's very, I've been speaking to a few people. For instance, Lynelle George remembers completely the last performance she went to at CAP at UCLA. It's as if there's a watershed moment before and after. And interestingly enough, I was fascinated to read your New Yorker piece about the last concert that the Berlin Philharmonic gave. Can you describe that? I think it's so beautiful.
Yeah, well, that was right after, and the Berlin Philharmonic had rehearsed this program and proceeded to play it in the Great Philharmonie Concert Hall in Berlin without an audience. And immediately after that, even these private gatherings of 100 people in the orchestra would be forbidden. But for a few days, that still went on, and it was Simon Rattle, the former music director of the Berlin Philharmonic, conducting Berrioz's Sinfonia, this great surrealistic collage montage of musical voices from all different eras, and the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra. And there was something very powerful about it, I think. And Simon Rattle had very powerful words beforehand, and he immediately perceived what has come to be the case disastrously, catastrophically, that this shutdown would have a very severe effect on the performing arts. And it just remains to be seen how much will survive and how things will be able to go on and resume in the performing arts, because, of course, these will be the last segments of our society to reopen. This is a business that consists of cramming large numbers of people into small spaces to witness an event together, and so it's a very, very tough situation lying ahead, or already that we are now.
Yeah, we'll certainly get to that. But what struck me is also what you write about those strong words. You say in a pre-taped introduction for each piece, Rattle refused to peddle bromides about music's power to comfort and uplift, instead reminding viewers of the historical darkness from which these works arose. That historical darkness. Now we have I don't know if one would call it a historical darkness, but darkness for sure. And not words of comfort given there, not easy, cheesy words of comfort given that are so often given before concerts, that music will be a balm. You speak in such a fascinating way about your experience of listening and epiphanies of listening. Since this pandemic, have you had such experiences? Have you had such epiphanies in listening?
Yes, a few. Of course, I've been listening. I continue to listen as ever to recordings from my library of recordings, and sometimes I think certain pieces have struck me in ways that they have not before. I found myself entirely swept away by Poulenc's great Stabat Mater, which is a work of a kind of spare, melancholy, beautiful, sort of modern religious presence, and that had quite an effect on me. Of course, Bach, Saint Matthew, and Saint John Passions are works that I like to say they see every catastrophe coming in advance. No matter what is happening,
we'll always be ready. We'll always be ready, right?
Yeah. We have yet to concoct a catastrophe.
We're a resourceful bunch. Maybe we will, but for the moment, Bach has done.
Yeah, Bach has our number. But then, of course, I've been spending a lot of time listening online to these live streams, and this is something which began really immediately after the shutdown. That Berlin Philharmonic concert was, on the one hand, part of the Philharmonic's usual series of concerts that they put online in their digital concert hall, but of course now it had quite a different atmosphere to it. But on that same day, March 12th, and you're right, these dates are stuck in my memory.
Yeah, really,
Yeah, the great young German pianist Igor Levitz began what would turn out to be 52 consecutive performances in his apartment in Berlin. Night after night, he set up a very simple, very rudimentary system, filming himself at the piano on his iPhone and then broadcasting it out onto Twitter. And he began with Beethoven's Waldstein Sonata that day, and went on to cover an extraordinary breadth of repertory from very famous works by Beethoven, Schubert, Liszt, and so on, to obscure, arcane, magnificent pieces like Ronald Stevenson's Passacaglia on DSCH, and he played the Reshevsky People United variations as well, and so it was just an extraordinary feat, and those performances sometimes were very, very striking, just in terms of how his particular choice of particular day would sneak up on you, and you could see the way he himself was gripped and moved by what he was playing. So I had already been working on an article for the New Yorker about him since last summer. Actually, I've been periodically seeing him in Europe and talking to him and watching him perform. And then the shutdown happened, and at first I feared that I would no longer have an ending to my article. On the low level of fears and anxiety.
Right, but still,
but of course, writers are always extremely self-centered. What is this going to do to my piece? But I needn't have worried, of course, because Igor, who is an extraordinarily alert and engaged individual among classical musicians, who often are not quite so alert and engaged, frankly. He seized upon this moment. He saw his own role that he could play in it. And so suddenly I had, well, not only the ending, but also the beginning of the piece in terms of talking about his house concerts, Hauskonzerte in German. And so I still do regret, though, he had been building up to a performance of this monumental piano concerto by Ferruccio Busoni, which is more than an hour long, and it also involves a male chorus singing a hymn to Allah. It's a bizarre and extraordinary and magnificent piece. Busoni was just not among the most famous names in classical music, but an absolute genius as pianist, as composer, as thinker. So this was going to be his great feat of the spring, playing the Busoni Concerto in Rome, and of course it didn't happen. And I still wanted to talk to him about it. Yeah, and it was quite striking. I should have realized that this was maybe not the best avenue to pursue, but I kept sort of asking him, "Oh, can we talk about this concerto?" And we were just talking through the computer on FaceTime and so on. And I just really wanted to hear it because I love the piece. And so he started talking about it, and he started playing bits and pieces of it, and he broke off, and I suddenly realized this is. And he said something like, "It's so heartbreaking. I didn't get to play this. I could cry." And I realized this was crushing for him. That's something that he had been working on for months and months was not going to happen, and to sort of bring it up and force him to talk about it and to play it was, of course, it was very agreeable about the whole thing. But I realized there's so many different levels of loss, that people are experiencing. And just this whole idea of future plans and projects and of course, much deeper than that, lives and livelihoods and being destroyed, but no one is unaffected, and so there's all these different kinds of loss that are taking place.
And you were mentioning before that Bach can come to the rescue in moments of catastrophe, in moments of grief, in moments of loss. Someone else who you turn to in these moments and poignantly have written about recently is Brahms. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I found your ruminations really moving, where you write, "He's a great poet of the ambiguous, in between, nameless emotions, ambient unease, pervasive wistfulness, bemused resignation, contained rage, ironic merriment, smiling through tears, the almost pleasurable fatigue of deep depression." Mm-hmm. Really tremendous, Alex, I must say. And in your own journey now, Brahms has taken on a big meaning for you.
Yeah. Oh, thanks so much. This piece came out of a loss that I experienced before coronavirus really arrived in the United States at full strength. Back in late February, my mother, who was 91, died in Washington, D.C. And it happened quite suddenly, although with a woman of that age, a person of that age, one always has to be prepared in some way, and we were actually relieved that it happened at home and relatively without pain. She had been suffering from Parkinson's disease for many years. But I learned this at 9 p.m. at night and got myself to LAX for the last overnight flight and arrived in D.C. The next day to start preparing for the funeral with my brother. And of course, I couldn't sleep in the plane and I couldn't watch a silly movie. So I listened to Brahms. So late, I had this playlist on my phone of the final works of Brahms in chronological order. And it's always been my favorite music. It certainly spoke to me in that state of grief, or it wasn't even really grief yet. It was just a shock and the kind of numbness. But it's music that I turn to under any circumstances, and that's sort of what I was writing about in that piece. I was sort of suggesting that this music that people could turn to who are experiencing the same in this terrible time. But going back to what you were saying earlier about the bromides, about music being consolation and sort of uplifting us and so on. Music can do so many things,
right?
And we can do so many things to music. I mean, the relationship is very complicated, and a carefree, happy piece can have a crushing effect on us because of some association that we have, and something very tragic might have a kind of invigorating effect on us. So it's just a relationship that can't be matched. It can't be explained. It's
thankfully. I mean, it can't be explained, and then there's Alex Ross explaining it at certain moments.
Well, explaining the inexplicability.
Well, yes, approximating. It's an how do you call it in mathematics? An asymptote. It's reaching, trying to, and it's the space in between what you're trying to reach and the experience you've had, which you talk about so beautifully. Also, in another essay, you talk about a concert you went to in 1989, which remains visceral. You say it remains one of the most visceral listening experience of my life. A concert of with Cecil Taylor, and I'm wondering what do you mean by that, and are there other performances you would put in that category? And what does visceral experience mean to you?
Yes, well, that event does certainly stick in my head. It was a stage on a journey that had begun when I was in college in those years. I arrived in college utterly ignorant of anything outside of classical music. And I'd somehow gotten all the way through high school without listening to a note of anything else that kids my age were paying attention to, which of course made me tremendously popular in high school, as you can imagine. But then I began to be educated, and friends in college sort of found these thresholds for me. I couldn't enter just by sort of listening to the Beatles or Bob Dylan. I had to enter through the sort of avant-garde back door. So the first jazz that I listened to was Cecil Taylor and Ornette Coleman, and the first rock I listened to was Pere Ubu and Sonic Youth, these quite dissonant post-punk bands. And my friends knew that this would sort of catch my ear because at the time I was very into this extremely noisy, dissonant, wonderful post-war avant-garde music. And so I listened to Cecil Taylor on record, and then with friends, we went to a live show that he did with a trio in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1989. And as much as I love the music on record, I was completely unprepared for the viscerality of him, never mind my own experience, just the titanic, the sort of dam-bursting energy of how he attacked the piano. And I very distinctly remember this moment. Right from the start, it was a frenzy of activity, and it was just this extraordinary energy, this velocity. Him and his the other members of the trio, and then after 10 minutes, suddenly it started. It leapt to some entirely new plateau hypervelocity and hyperkinesis and how that intensification took place when it already seemed to have already reached the maximum of what could be achieved was, I mean, that was what absolutely left me gasping in wonder. Just that sense of just kind of hyperspace, leaving the hyperspace. And, but this was, the experience on my part was, this could have been entirely typical of the concerts that he was giving in this period. Maybe it was an off night. Actually, maybe the next night it was even more intense. But for me, in that moment, it was my own leap forward.
Yeah,
it was my own moment of discovery.
Right, and these memories of feeling at one with music, of feeling overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. The memory of intensity, it can be so powerful. And I'm wondering now, we're speaking on the day of the birth of Wagner. How propitious could that be? And you just finished a monumental book on Wagner, and I'd love you to say something to our listeners about Wagner and chaos, about Wagner and these times.
Yes, well, he is the Lord of Chaos in many ways, a composer who has found himself swept up in an unimaginable variety of circumstances and situations and contexts. In many ways, has imposed himself on those contexts politically, in literature and in the arts and so many other ways. And so the book that I wrote, which I'm just making the very final corrections on now, it's called Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. And it's a study of this relationship, really, between listener and music. And the music itself is actually somewhat beside the point. Of course, there's a lot of material in the book about Wagner himself, his life, his writings, the works. But that is really not what the book is about. It is the effect that he had on principally other artists, as well as politics, philosophy, and various other aspects. Really, the heart of the relationship is how he affected other artists. And it's a fascinating relationship because very often what they took from him was something that he could not possibly have intended. And there was this great moment that took place in January of 1860. He went to Paris to give 3 concerts at the Théâtre Italien. And in the audience was Charles Baudelaire. And Baudelaire was absolutely overwhelmed by the experience. He wrote this fantastic letter, talking about how he was penetrated by the music, how it just sort of completely unmanned him almost.
His Cecil Taylor moment.
Yes. And then he proceeded to start working on this great essay, because Wagner and Tannhäuser of Paris. And yes, Baudelaire is overwhelmed by Wagner, but also he is overwhelming, he is overpowering, he is appropriating Wagner. Because when he starts talking about a counter-religion, a satanic religion in Tannhäuser, when he starts talking about these dream states and forests of symbols, he is pulling Wagner into his own world. And there's a fascinating letter that Wagner wrote back to Baudelaire after that essay was published. And I can't honestly believe that he approved of what Baudelaire had written. But I think what so impressed him and what left him sort of almost helpless with gratitude, which was not a usual state of mind for him, was this sense that he had such a strong effect and that his work was taking on this life in another culture, another city, with a very different artistic mind. And I think he saw there a glimpse of his immortality, how his work would persist and sort of echo forward. Now, there is, of course, a tremendously dark side to that experience of being overwhelmed, because the young Adolf Hitler had a very similar experience when he was a teenager. And it was a scene that you actually see often. It's fascinating. All these different scenes you see in literature of the fin de siècle. A young person goes to see Wagner and is overwhelmed, but also has a sensation of their own power, their own future awakening. And this is something that Willa Cather depicted. W.E.B. Du Bois depicted it in his amazing story of the Coming of John, a young black man. Gay people, all different backgrounds, Jewish people. But with Hitler, of course, that sensation of future power assumed a supremely dark and threatening form.
And you've written about it incredibly powerfully in an article about Hitler and America. I mean, it looms in the background of everything you write about, it seems to me. And one of the things that I'm so interested in is in order to be a music critic, I sometimes feel that Alex Ross needs to write about other things than music. For instance, he needs to write about bristlecone pines. I wonder if you crave an escape from writing about just music.
Well, I think, I've always been a person of many interests, and after college, I drifted into becoming a music critic without having any great plan to do so. So I sort of found myself doing it, or it found me, without my having envisioned it in advance. And I don't regret it, of course, at all. Music is the center of my career as a writer, and my relationship with The New Yorker has enabled everything else that I've done in terms of the books and other kinds of work. And yet, I think both because I always see music entangled in neighboring spheres, and simply because I roam around and take fascination in so many different aspects of life, as everyone does. No one is completely specialized and confined. I do have, and it's really thanks to The New Yorker, a certain freedom to drift outside of my area of expertise and specialty and to explore. I've done a couple of these natural sciences essays in recent years. I've written about 20th century history and a bit of philosophy, and yet it does all go back to music in a sense. I mean, when I was in the bristlecone pine forest in the White Mountains in California, it was often the sound or the lack of sound in the trees.
Right.
The absolute. It wasn't silence. It was a kind of sounding emptiness, which is in fact exactly something that Wagner writes about in one of his essays. He talks about this, the resounding silence of the forest. Baudelaire talks about it too. So this is a very romantic idea. The sound of nature at rest, and so I do think about it in those terms.
And in a less romantic mode, in closing, I want to perhaps end on a more dire note. The nature of this moment now. You write that an extinction event is looming over the performing arts, and it calls for a change of practices. What are those changes that need to happen? And you speak brilliantly about the internet and how free it is, but also at what cost, and at what cost for the orchestras, the musicians, the livelihood of people who have not yet made it and make their life on a daily basis, and without performing, are perhaps losing something not only for the listeners but for themselves.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I don't know the future at all. You sort of envision a range of scenarios from the not so bad to the totally catastrophic. But it's already bad enough, just as it is here in the middle of May. Of course, freelance musicians, their livelihoods have completely ground to a halt, and they live from week to week and month to month on payment from gigs. And so they're in a very dire situation. But also, orchestra full-time tenured orchestra members who really had it made in terms of, this is the ultimate sort of career that you can win as an oboist, as a clarinetist, as playing any instruments to have a position in an orchestra. But their salaries have been cut. The entire orchestra and chorus of the Metropolitan Opera have been furloughed and aren't being paid at all. A lot of the others are being paid a portion of their salaries. So this is really harsh. But the institutions themselves are in great danger. The finances of the classical music world have always been fragile and murky, and it could take not too much of a push to send a number of institutions into bankruptcy, into extinction altogether. So I just don't know how it's all going to turn out. In terms of what attitudes we can change.
Yeah, the change of practices.
Course, I mean, on the one hand, all this live stream music on the internet, which I've been listening to, is great. But this has already been happening. We've already had this enormous shift of music online, and the expectation really since the Napster era that music was just going to be free for the taking there online. And, the answer to that was so often, well, musicians make their money touring. They don't need money selling recordings anymore, but they can make it touring. Well, now the touring has ended. And now you see people in the pop world with no source of income whatsoever. And so I think we see the consequences of a culture of monopoly, a culture dominated by the big tech world. I'm very skeptical of Spotify and the other streaming services because of the incredibly puny amounts that they pay to artists in terms of royalty. Even just in terms of how these giant conglomerates seem to have taken over all of culture, all of the media. There's this huge media crisis right now too. More people than ever are going on news websites, and yet people aren't making money. People are losing money because so much of the ad revenue goes to Google and Facebook rather than to the news organization. There's no print revenue advertising anymore, so it's a total crisis in the media world. And these crises are coming out of the structure that we've created for ourselves, I think, in the digital era. So in terms of changing practices, we need to invest in culture as individuals, as a society, in political terms, although, of course, I have very little hope of some kind of renaissance of the New Deal for the arts that happened after the Great Depression in the 1930s. But we can at least dream about it, or perhaps take the first tiny steps in that direction. But this is going to be very difficult again, because the arts will be the performing arts will be the last to go back to work, and it could be a year or more. And I just would not be surprised if a number of very famous, very venerable organizations fell by the wayside. I hope not too many.
We must hope that somehow people will also have the confidence of sitting next to each other, and that will be so hard before a vaccine is found. I mean, there's so many conditions for life to go back to not normal, because in a way normal got us into huge trouble.
Yeah. Oh, that's the point. Of course, the hope is that we can return to a different kind of normal,
right?
And that we can adapt certain emergency measures that have fallen into place on our way to building actually a more equitable and a more environmentally sound society. And I don't have great hopes for that, just because of the political conditions we find ourselves in. But we can talk about it. We can dream about it.
Yeah, but we're at a moment, Alex, where I wish we had more time, and I wish I could talk to you now about, if we brought some of the members of the so-called Frankfurt School to talk with us now. What would Adorno say? What would Benjamin say? What would others say at this moment? We Scholle Molle spoke about shards of hope. What are the thinking in a utopian way about changing culture and changing society. Changing culture can only happen if we change society in some form or fashion. And there's this notion that maybe the pandemic, as Arundhati Roy says, is a portal. One hopes, and one hopes also that we can go back to listening, not just online. I mean, I'm enjoying watching Yo-Yo Ma play, but it's truly, at the same time that I'm enjoying it, I feel such a deep level of frustration, which is, I think, natural. I prefer the real McCoy, whoever McCoy was,
Right. Yes. Well, there's the social psychological element, just of enjoying something in a group, in a space, but also there's just so much information lost, just in purely physical terms, in terms of the sounds, the resonances, the way instruments reverberate in a room. You just can't capture that. No technology exists to capture the fullness of that harmony, to adapt a phrase from Thomas Mann, whom we could also talk about.
we might actually say thankfully so. Thankfully it can't be captured through technical means. Alex, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I give you a virtual hug. I hope that I'll be able to see you in person before long. And
absolutely.
Thank you so much. And I'm so looking forward to reading your book, Wagnerism, as soon as it comes out. When is it coming out?
September 15th.
September 15th.
Anticipated date.
All the best to you, and thank you so much for taking our call, and be well and stay safe.
Thank you, Paul. This was wonderful.
Bye-bye. It really was. Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.